Welcome to Situational Awareness Tactics Podcast. This podcast provides the crucial art of understanding current elements in an environment to increase your safety and survival. Here's your host, forensic psychologist and consultant, Dr. Carlos.
Welcome, everybody. Today we have a special guest with us. We're going to get into the world of knife fighting. With us is Scott Babb. He's a lifelong martial artist and the founder of Libre Fighting. Libre Fighting is Libre Fighting, the most widely recognized knife-based combat system in the world. He is considered one of the world's leading and most innovative voices on the subject of knife combat. Scott has worked with members of various security, military, special forces, and law enforcement groups in the U.S. and Mexico. He's been featured on Vice.com, CNN, Indonesia, Recoil Concealment, Blade Magazine, and in Tactical Knives Magazine. And I highly recommend you go visit his website. It's librefighting.bigcartel.com. Seems to be the address. You can go check it out over there. Excellent stuff. Definitely recommend it. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get started with this show. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you for having me, man. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for being here. Truly a fun conversation I think we're going to have today. Oh, and before I get started, folks, if you want to support our podcast, make sure to share it and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Scott, you've been around martial arts for a long time, for decades. And you've been training knife combat for a very long time. Where did knife combat training begin for you?
I was actually teaching with a youth group, which sounds like an odd way to get into knife fighting, but the instructor that I was assisting was involved in Filipino martial arts before Filipino martial arts really blew up in the mid-90s, and he introduced me to stick and knife fighting and got me involved in it. And at the time, I'd been doing martial arts since I was 8 years old, and I was 15. I'd never heard of Filipino martial arts. I wasn't aware that there were martial arts in the Philippines, and he started showing me the stick and knife work, and I was just immediately fascinated by it. And within a few months, we had started doing private lessons under our instructor. We trained for 7 years privately under him, doing private lessons 2 to 3 times a week. And we were teaching together 4 times a week, and then Sunday mornings we would get together and train by a lake for a couple hours. So 7 days a week we were either teaching or training, and I just became fascinated with weapons-based martial arts. Early on, I was actually more intrigued by the stick fighting, and still probably my passion. I enjoy doing the stick work more, but in California, where I am, carrying baton is illegal, but carrying knives is California actually has pretty open knife laws as far as what you can carry. So it didn't make sense to really focus on stick work in California. It made more sense to focus on knife work, where it's a weapon you can actually have with you.
When you talk about stick fighting, are you referring to Kali?
Yes.
Okay.
In Filipino martial arts in general. Eskrima, Kali, Arnis. And the system I came up in was more stick-based. It did have a knife component, but it was based more around the traditional Filipino stuff. There's a misconception. People tend to think that I don't advocate the practice of Filipino martial arts because it's not something I personally do anymore. I think Filipino martial arts are actually very effective in the environment that they were developed in. When you're using a very big, heavy agricultural blade and you're in a tropical environment where people are wearing very light, sleeveless clothing, you could do a tremendous amount of damage with these heavy blades against, a body that has very few layers protecting it. But when you start to transition to how knives are used in the Western world, we don't carry these big, heavy blades. We carry small pocket knives or a small fixed blade knife, and most parts of this country, there are times of the year where people are going to wear several layers of clothing. And so if you have a pocket knife and you're in Chicago in the winter, and you go to use this pocket knife and slash against an attacker who's wearing a heavy winter coat, chances are you're just going to ruin his jacket. You're not going to reach flesh. Or if you do, it's not going to be a crippling wound. And so when I started actually studying the way knife violence unfolds, actually seeing CCTV footage of knife assaults, and comparing that to the way I'd been trained in Filipino martial arts, I started to see that there was a cultural disparity between the way knives are used in the Western world and the way knives are used in Southeast Asia, and the types of knives that are used and the dynamics that play out in a bladed altercation. there are parts of the rural Philippines where you still see, people dueling with machetes, or where they'll square off and, actually have more of a dueling type scenario where it's a more measured confrontation. But in the West, knives are used either as a compliance tool, as, part of a robbery, an abduction, or a sexual assault, or it's used as a murder weapon. You don't really see the situation playing out where two guys are just going to mutually agree to engage in a knife fight and square off and exchange with each other.
Are you telling me that John Wick movies aren't real? What's going on here?
At least the John Wick movies, they do capture like the intensity of violence. It doesn't play out like as a polite exchange like you see in a lot of older school movies that had like knife work in them. But so we started seeing how the dynamics played out in knife confrontations in the Western world, and working backwards from there. When you start to see that in the West, the average knife assault, the guy's not gonna approach you with hostility. Usually, he's not gonna brandish the knife and storm you. He's gonna get in close with the knife concealed and start sticking, do a prison stabbing type situation where he attaches to your clothing, grabs the back of your head, and starts prison shanking you. And it's likely gonna happen in some kind of enclosed environment where you're not going to be able to create distance, and it's going to be a very violent, very sudden assault. And so we started adapting our training to reflect that reality and pressure testing against that type of assault. People ask me, like, how would your system stack up against this other system if you went head-to-head? And my response is always, honestly, I don't care. I'm not worried about having to confront another trained knifer from another system. I'm worried about, the crackhead on the street who's trying to murder me. So my question would be, how does the other system stack up against that reality?
That's the neat thing about your system. It was, if I'm correct, it was based on the real world was the research laboratory, I guess you could call it. Would that be fair to say?
We were in a really fortunate position where early on, Ed Calderon of Ed's Manifesto, when he was still active down in Mexico, he had reached out to me and about training the guys he was working with down there. And he had reached out to several prominent knife instructors who were far more well-known than me at the time in the States and asked them to come down and work with his team. And they were all like, Mexico? Nah, I'm not going down there. And I'm in San Diego. I grew up 20 minutes from Mexico. And like all people who grew up in San Diego, when you turn 18, you spend from 18 to 21 in Tijuana because you can drink and party down there, and you can't drink and party up here. So I was very comfortable with Tijuana in Mexico. So when he asked me if I'd go down there, I was like, yeah, sure. He was like, really? And I was like, yeah, no problem. So I started working with Ed. We worked with his guys down there, and he told me early on, he's like, within a couple months, these guys are going to be out in the field utilizing what we're teaching them. Sure enough, within like 2 months, one of the guys who we trained down there had knifed someone, and we were able to get real-world feedback. And then Ed was really aggressive about going out and working this with various groups in Mexico. These guys would go out and apply the skills we were teaching them and bring us real-world feedback. And so we were able to adapt and refine what we were doing based on what was happening down in Mexico. So we were in this really fortunate position where I was in San Diego and Libre was starting to get known, so people were flying in from all over the country and all over the world to train with me, bringing me their insights and their takes on it, and we were taking that and adapting it and refining it. We'd pressure test things up here, then we could go down to Mexico and teach those guys down there who were going up against the drug cartels. And those guys would go out and apply this in the field and tell us, like, okay, this is how it happened, this is how the person reacted to this is what produced an immediate result, this is what they didn't register when we hit them with this, and we were able to streamline and adapt and refine what we were doing based on that. Like, for example, one of the things that one of the revisions that we were able to make was we'd always had eye attacks as part of the system, but it wasn't a really prominent part of the system. But the first time one of our guys had actually used an eye attack on someone, the guy dropped like a stone. And what we found was attacking the eyes, and even if you missed the eye, just getting near the eye with a sharp piece of metal produced an immediate and dramatic reaction. And the majority of the time, the person would just drop like a stone just based off getting hit in the eye. So we restructured the system so the first thing we teach someone now is how to attack to the eye, because it's a less lethal option. I hate using the term non-lethal with any kind of knife work because there's so many variables. One misplaced shot takes a theoretical non-lethal technique and makes it lethal. But it's a less lethal option that produces an immediate, dramatic result that can allow you to take control of the situation if you need to press the engagement further and actually get lethal with it. And then things like sensory removal techniques. Like we were training these guys in sensory removal techniques, and the first time someone went out and did one in the field.
Let me stop you for a second. What did you say? Sensory removal?
Yes. Like,
can you explain to the audience, just in case they're not aware of it?
That would be if there's like
a guard or something.
Yes. I mean, this sounds very dark.
Jason Bourne-ish.
Yeah, but it's actually approaching someone from behind. Who's armed, a guard, and actually taking them out from behind. The first time we actually had someone in the field use one of these techniques, I can give you the broad strokes of what happened. Part of it, I was asked not to share, like as far as specific location.
Sure.
But it was a ranch house that was in a valley in a rural part of Mexico. Two teams, one was coming up the front, one was coming up the back. The one coming up the back actually spotted a guard up on the hill. They spotted him because he was smoking a cigarette and playing on his cell phone. And so the guy came up behind him. And so the guy actually, later told me, he's like, dude, when was I ever going to get the chance to do this in the field again? He's like, so I decided to do it because otherwise they would have just kind of stormed the guy quickly, the entire group, and tried to overwhelm him and put him on the ground. And so he told one of the guys, put him in your crosshairs. If he sees me coming, take his head off. And they said, what are you going to do? And he just drew his knife and went ninjing off into the brush. And he came up behind the guy and did the sensory removal technique. And we learned several things from him actually applying this in the field. The first was the bleed-out time was much longer than any timetable of death would have said. And when we talked to medical professionals, one of the things that they told us probably contributed to this was most of the timetables of death you see are based around someone being at a fighting heart rate, whereas this guy was totally relaxed. So when the altercation started, he was at a resting heart rate, which meant he bled out a bit slower than he otherwise would have. But another thing that he found was when he took the guy down, it was dark, and the guy was wearing plate carriers, so he couldn't actually see the targets that he would normally hit following up while the guy's on the ground. So we actually started practicing doing these techniques in low-light situations where you're using your hand to feel where the plates are and find the targets in the dark and hit them. And then another thing that he found when this happened was the guy actually was reaching for his cell phone trying to signal for help. And he actually caught him and took the phone and threw it off into the brush. But one of the things we teach now based on that is after you actually do the work on the ground, doing what we call purging, searching the person, seeing if there's any secondary weapons or communications devices on them while they're bleeding out. And I know this all sounds very violent and very morbid, but this is the reality of knife combatives, is that it's not a polite or a sterilized sort of combatives aspect to explore. It is a very dark, very messy and uncomfortable thing to discuss. And I think if you're not uncomfortable discussing knife combatives, you're probably a sociopath, because it is a very dark subject to explore.
It is. I mean, a lot of people, you can't make war pretty. War or even defending yourself. I mean, cartels are not going to say, oops, sorry, we stepped on your toe. And unfortunately, it works that way.
And I think there's been a movement, or there was a movement within the knife combatives world to sort of boil down knife combatives into pattern drills and flow patterns and sort of give and take. And I think part of the reasoning behind that was to sterilize it and to make it more approachable. Because, it should make you uncomfortable when you're doing it. You should feel like, wow, this isn't if you're enjoying what you're doing, you're either not doing something that's reflecting the realities of knife combatives, or there's something mentally wrong with you, because there's a level of violence, there's a visceral nature to it that you have to be aware of and have to sort of process as part of your training.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, a lot of times people, when you look at knife fighting or just using a knife in general, it's much more personal. I mean, homicide detectives will tell you that. Somebody who kills somebody with a knife, if it isn't out of opportunity, right? If they're breaking into a house and they grab a butter knife or a knife in the kitchen, that's a little different. But if the killer actually brings a knife to murder someone, it's different than if they use the gun. It's a lot more personal, and you can usually identify that the person probably knows that individual in one capacity or another.
Yeah, it is a very personal sort of. I don't want to use the word intimate, but there's there is like just you're actually going to have blood on you and have and actually experience what the person you're fighting is going through, which is something else we built into our training based on that sensory removal scenario. When the guy who actually performed the technique came back to his group, he was covered in so much blood they thought he had been shot, and they made him strip down and went over him with flashlights to make sure he wasn't hit. It was just there was so much arterial spray and so much blood, he actually got completely coated in it. He ended up catching pneumonia based on this because it was in November, and he had to continue on with the mission covered in this guy's blood, which is something when we started doing like anti-abduction training, we would tell people, like, look, as ridiculous as this sounds, if you're in a situation where you've been abducted, you forge a weapon, and you're able to perform some kind of sensory removal technique and escape, and this is more training that's done in Mexico because with our Mexico chapters, there's one of their major concerns is abductions because abductions are so prevalent in Mexico. One of the things we tell them is, as ridiculous as it sounds, you may want to strip down first, perform the technique, and then get dressed, because if you're worried about being pursued afterwards, you don't want to be trailing blood and moving through a remote area in blood-soaked clothing. And when I did a bit of research, I found out this was actually something that mafia hitmen used to do. They actually stripped down to their underwear to perform the hit, so there wouldn't be any spray or any sort of residue on them when they were doing a close-quarters hit, and then they would get dressed and leave. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's a very, it's something to take into consideration.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, Scott? Because intuition plays a role, but sometimes intuition isn't reality.
Yeah, yeah, it's it's one of the things I try to instill when I teach is that this isn't going to be pretty. It's not going to feel like a martial arts movie where you're going to be, when you cut someone, it's going to be like a thin red line. It's going to be a gruesome wound, and it's going to be a disturbing thing. And if you're ever in a position where you have to take someone's life with a knife, that's going to be an experience that changes who you are fundamentally for the rest of your life, and is not something anyone should ever willingly want to engage in. And one of the things I actually tell people when I train them is, if you find yourself starting to get to a point where you're overly comfortable with the idea of doing this, you need to step away from your training. You need to step back from it and get some perspective, because this isn't something that should be comfortable. It's something that you should never want to have to experience in real life. It's one of the most kind of disturbing ways to engage in violence as far as I'm concerned, because it is something that's going to be lethal. It's going to be messy. It's going to be bloody. But if you're not training for that reality of it, you're going to be shocked when this does happen, and it's going to throw off your response. Like one of the things I train with my guys, like when we do the eye attacks, for instance, is we'll put them in a fencing mask, and when the eye attack is hit, we'll have the person grab their face and scream like they've been hit in the eye, and that's so that they're used to the visual and auditory stimulus that's gonna happen when this happens in real life. If all you've ever done is just thrown the stab and had someone be static or not really react or kind of passively go through the motion of clutching their face, in the real world, if you ever do this and the person screams bloody murder and is kind of writhing around, that's going to put you in a complete state of shock where you're going to freeze at least for a beat, maybe for longer. And so you have to build in that component of, this is what it's really going to be like when you do this. And again, that's something that on the outside, from someone looking on the outside at this kind of training, might be like, oh man, that's really morbid, and they're sort of glorifying the violence. And it's not about glorifying the violence. It's about creating a training scenario where it's going to be as real as possible, where you're going to try and factor in as many real-life components as you can, so that if you ever are in the horrible situation of having to do this in the real world, you have a better idea of what to expect, and you're not going to be as shocked when you get that real reaction out of someone.
Great point. I mean, it looks like there's also a lot of psych prepping going on in your courses as well. And it's a great thing, because you're right. Once you've done this, it's you do change as a person, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I've actually had people at seminars who have used knives before they trained with me, and who've come up to me during seminars and been like, "Dude, I need to step outside. This is, essentially they were experiencing, a mild or sometimes more than a mild form of PTSD, where it was just like, they're like, this is starting to feel a bit too familiar to me, and they had to remove themselves. And I get that. And so now it's a question I actually ask people, and it's something I address at the beginning of seminars, where I'm like, if anyone starts to get uncomfortable with this, if you've been in this kind of scenario before and you start to experience, emotions you're not comfortable with, just quietly call me over, explain to me what's going on, and, remove yourself. Don't subject yourself to this if it's going to bring up any sort of dark memories that you're going to have to reprocess over it.
Absolutely. Go ahead. I'm going to shift gears if we can for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I'm going to shift from the psychology of it, which was really a great conversation. I want to shift a little bit to what knives would you recommend for the civilian to carry to protect themselves? Are there knives that you prefer over others?
Generally, I quote John Lennon when it comes to this. I'm an artist. You give me a tuba, I'll bring you something out of it. If you give me something sharp, pointy, and sturdy, I'll make it work.
Oh, wow.
But that being said, if the answers I give are usually not the answers people want to hear, because to me, the sexy stuff that people really sort of get intrigued by with knives doesn't matter to me at all. They're like, do you prefer a Persian-style blade or a tanto? And really, I don't give a fuck. Sorry, I curse a lot. I'm trying to watch it. But I don't care about stuff like that. To me, I'm more concerned with the handle. Does the handle give me a good, solid grip? Is the handle going to prevent my hand from sliding onto the blade and cutting myself? If it's a folding knife, does it have a good, solid locking mechanism that isn't going to fail on me? Does it feel comfortable in all grips? Can I use it in a forward grip or a reverse grip? Or is it a purpose-built knife that's meant to be used in one grip? Because that's going to determine how I carry it and the situation it's going to be in. Things about like what kind of metal is it made out of, or what kind of blade design aren't as relevant to me as the simple question of, is this a knife that's going to be comfortable carrying every day? Because people tend to spend a lot of money on really nice, custom-designed, tactical knives. But if it's a big, bulky, like, say, for example, a folder, if it's a sort of a heavy, bulky folder that takes up a lot of space in your pocket, eventually you're going to get to the point where it's just going to be too much of a hassle to carry. One day you're just going to be like, oh, man, I don't feel like having to dig around, this knife in my pocket today. And you're not going to take it with you that day. And then you're going to get to the point where every few days you're leaving it home, and then, like, half the time you're not carrying it. Eventually you just stop carrying the knife just because it's a hassle to carry. So to me, the most important thing is this a knife that you're going to be comfortable carrying day to day, every day? And if it isn't, it's not the right knife. And, of course, a lot of that's going to determine your situation. If you're just a civilian who's just going about your business and you have a normal job where you're not, working in military or law enforcement or any kind of security capacity, you're probably going to want a knife you can put in your pocket and just forget about. And, you're probably largely going to be using this as a tool to cut open boxes or, cut bindings or whatever it may be. And its secondary purpose will be for self-protection or as a weapon. So in that scenario, it's important to have a knife that you're going to be able to put in your pocket and just sort of forget it's there. Which is one of the things I like about, for production knives, I really like about Spyderco, is they tend to have thinner, lighter knives, and when you put it in your pocket, it's, you can kind of just forget it's there for a long time until you need it. Personally, with folding knives, I like the Emerson Wave feature because you can you can set it up to deploy in a point-down edge in grip with one, and you can draw it with one hand. The hook catches on your pocket unfolds the knife in one motion. So it can go from being folded in your pocket to open and deployed in less than a second.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I actually did a video, I think last year, where I went from having it deployed in my pocket to striking the opponent, and I was able to deploy it and strike the opponent 2 to 3 times in less than 1 second.
What about
so
the carabin?
For a folding knife,
I'm sorry.
For me, any knife that requires me to put a finger through a hole is a deal breaker.
Oh, interesting.
To me, it creates a lot more problems than it solves. It's like, yes, it's going to give you excellent retention on a knife, but especially with a hooked blade like a karambit, if you hook in behind bone and the knife gets stuck and your finger's attached to it and the person falls or moves or spins in a way you don't expect, it can do a lot of damage to your finger. If you're in a situation where the knife's in your right hand and you're being restrained and you need to pass the knife to your left hand to continue utilizing it, if it's on your finger and you've got to sort of roll it off of one finger and onto another to continue using it, that's going to take a degree of fine motor skills that you're probably not going to have in that kind of life and death situation. So what we use is, it's something that was actually taught to me by a practitioner of Kesey and Defense Labs, is it's essentially just a wristband, or a thick rubber band you wear on your wrist, and you can pull it over your hand and attach the knife to your hand that way. So you get the retention, but you can still easily pass it to your left hand as well. So it kind of splits the difference. You don't have the risk of having a metal ring around your finger that's going to potentially break your finger or rip the skin off your finger if it gets stuck in something and they move. But it still does give you enough retention that you're not going to lose the knife. You're not going to drop it in an altercation. And that kind of deep hook as well, where you have sort of a deep, really pronounced hook in a blade, when that starts hooking behind bone and behind ribs and stuff, that you start to realize there's a really high risk of the knife getting lodged into the person, which the knife's in the opponent. But if you're in a situation where you're engaging multiple opponents and your knife is stuck in the first one, which, again, I realize this sounds very dark and morbid, but it's the reality of knife violence. If your knife is stuck in one opponent while there's a second or third opponent coming at you, you just put yourself in a really bad situation. So for those purposes, I'm not a huge fan of karambits or any knife where I have to put my finger through a hole in it to utilize it.
Interesting. Fascinating stuff, Scott.
Yeah. And a lot of this came from Ed Calderon, who I know you've had on your show. He does organic mediums training sessions, and it was actually something that originally started in the Black Box seminars that we were doing down in Tijuana, and he brought it up here to the States, where you actually work against dead pigs and with live blades, and you actually get the sensation of piercing flesh and stuff. And if anyone's serious about doing knife work and has a chance to go to one of Ed's organic medium seminars, I highly recommend it, because that's where you start to realize things like the blade, hooked blades like that can get caught behind ribs, or that if your finger's through a hole and you start getting this pig kind of swinging and you hit it, and then you kind of get dragged along with the pig as it's swinging from a chain. All those little things that you don't really consider until you're actually working against something that has flesh and bone that you're putting a knife into. And for me at least, it was a very dark experience, the times that I've worked against dead pigs, because, here's an animal that was living at one point. It's hanging there, and you're just, stabbing and slashing on it and examining the damage you're doing. And it's not something that you necessarily feel positive about, but it's a reality that I think is important to experience. You need to know what the sensation of piercing flesh is going to be, or what kind of wound certain techniques are going to create on an organic medium. And a lot of the stuff that we've learned about karambits came from the research that I was doing with this, and just seeing what happened when people were using karambits on a pig, and seeing like, wow, this is this ring and this hooked blade. It does have some advantages, but the negatives are are at least as strong as the advantages, and probably there's more negatives than positives when you actually put this, weigh everything out.
Fascinating stuff. We could be here all day. I want to ask you this, a couple more things before we get ready to wrap up. You have a lot of different DVD sets on your website. Again, folks, it's librefighting.bigcartel.com. Libre is Libre. You have a lot of different ones. You got the Reaper method, La Mano 2-disc, Vintage Reaper method 4-disc. Tell us a little bit about some of these. Which ones would you, how about this? Which ones would you recommend for beginners? Which ones would be for advanced? What's going on with these sets? Really cool stuff.
We have a package, the Libre Fighting Guild Initiation package. That's the most updated curriculum, and I actually designed that to be a complete introduction to the system for a new student who isn't near a training group. We do have training groups all throughout the United States and all over the world, but not everyone is near a training group or a chapter, and obviously in-person training is always going to be the ideal way to learn this material. But this is actually it's a folder that has breaks down the system, the principles, the background of the system. There's a book in it that talks about mindset and tactics. There's 2 discs that cover the basic mechanics of it. And it was really meant to be a comprehensive look at not just the mechanics of how to use a knife, but the mentality and the tactics behind using it. And that's really what I'd recommend for a beginner, because that was specifically designed to give you a really comprehensive look at the blade work. And then the next level of that's the Journeyman Development Package, which goes into endemics, which is how knives are utilized in different parts of the world. For example, the way that knife violence occurs in more rural parts of Mexico is far different than the way it occurs in northern Mexico or in the States. When you get into more rural parts of Mexico, you'll see they'll actually wrap the jacket around their left arm and use a point-down grip and sort of square off in a dueling-type scenario. And you can see footage of this on YouTube, which is radically different from the way knives are used in northern Mexico and the States, where males will typically use a knife in a hammer grip, and it'll be more close quarters, and it'll be they'll be attacking from concealment. Some studies have shown if someone brandishes a knife, there's only about a 30% chance they're willing to use it because it's being used as a compliance tool. If someone's coming at you with lethal intent with a knife, typically they're not going to show you the knife ahead of time. They're going to be within 2 to 3 feet of you. They'll make contact. Within 10 seconds of making contact with you, the assault will start. So in the second level of this, we start to explore the way knives are utilized in different parts of the world and even just different regions of the United States. If you're in Chicago, for example, where people are going to be wearing thick, heavy winter coats, you're not really going to be able to ascertain through a good part of the year where the targets are beneath the coat. It's going to offer several layers of protection, so you're not going to be using very many slashing techniques. You're going to be directing most of your attacks to the face and neck. But where I am in San Diego, where you're only going to be someone's only going to be wearing a heavy jacket, maybe 2 weeks out of the year, you don't have those same kind of considerations. So even the way knife violence unfolds between the Southwest and the Northeast in the United States is far different. When you get into regions like New York, you see box cutters are very prevalent, and blades are utilized by gangs a lot. Spitting. Are you familiar with spitting razors at all?
No.
So this is something that you see in gangs in the Northeast a lot, where they'll actually keep razors in their mouth, and they'll spit it into their hand and slash. And this started in prisons, where you could approach someone and they'd see your hands were empty, and then they would spit the razor out of their mouth into their hand and slash you with it. And this is something that gangs will actually use as initiation sometimes. You'll have to slash just a random person with a razor, or just a small tap knife or a box cutter or what's called an ox, which is just another form of razor. So you start to see razors being utilized, and the attacks are a little bit more sophisticated than just a raw violence thing, because a lot of times these attacks are happening as either gang initiation or payback for something, and the tactics are more evolved than they are in other places. And then the way knives are used in the UK, where it's a very hot button issue, in the UK, knives are controversial the way guns are controversial here, because there's not a lot of gun violence, but there's a tremendous amount of knife violence in the UK. And so our chapters in the UK often have to train in secret because we've actually had media, news organizations try to implant people in our training groups there to kind of do, hit pieces on us, because knives are considered such a hot button issue there, and it's so controversial that it makes a good, it makes it for good ratings to say, hey, look at these guys training with knives, where knife violence is out of control where we are. So in the second level, we really start studying endemics, how knife violence unfolds in the Western world compared to different parts of the world, how different chapters have adapted their training accordingly, and how to sort of be aware of the kind of violence you'll likely face where you are and adapt your training for that. Because I think it's a mistake to assume the way that, that I train people here in San Diego is going to be perfectly suited for the way that, our UK chapters train, or our chapters in Mexico City or Monterrey, Mexico, or Southeast Asia train, because there are different backgrounds and different requirements and different endemics involved in how knife violence unfolds in these places. And you have to adapt your training to suit your environment.
So if I was going to start with knife fighting, or at least learning about your system, which DVD set would you recommend?
The Libre Fighting Guild Initiation Package, because it goes beyond the DVDs. It actually talks about the tactics, the mindset, and gives you a more well-rounded view of it. And this is a personal evolution for me. When I first started teaching, I came from a more martial arts mindset, where it was just about the techniques and about developing the physical skill. And as I've evolved as an instructor and a martial artist, as Libre's grown, taken on a more combative mindset, where it's about developing soft skill, how to deploy the knife, how to sense, how to be aware of prospective threats, how to mitigate those threats before they evolve, and being aware of the emotional and psychological component that's going to be happening before the altercation, during the altercation, and after the altercation. One of the law enforcement agents I train here in San Diego has done a lot of defensive tactics work, and he tells his people, there's three fights. There's the fight against yourself. Are you psychologically ready to do that, to fight for your life? There's the fight against the opponent. Do you have the skill to overcome the opponent? And then there's the fight against the system. Can you justify what you did was legal and necessary? And I would argue there's a fourth component to this, which is, can you live with yourself afterwards? Because every day for the rest of your life, you're going to wonder, did I have to do this? And so it's important to reflect on where that bar is and what you're willing to do to survive, and how you're going to process this in the aftermath for the rest of your life. Because if you're ever in this situation where you have to use this kind of lethal force in this manner, it's going to change you fundamentally. And for the rest of your life, you're going to wonder, did I have to do this? Was it absolutely necessary? And so I've tried to round out the training that I do to incorporate all of that, the psychological, I'm mentally capable of doing this. Can I prevail in the altercation? Can I prove that I was legally justified doing this? And can I live with myself afterwards? And that's really where I'm at now as an instructor, and that's where Libre's at as an organization.
Fascinating stuff, Scott. Again, there it is, Libre Knife Fighting Guild Initiation Package Level 1. You can find it at librefighting.bigcartel.com. It's a great package. It consists of two DVD discs talking about different types of grips. It consists of different little types of things, patches, and knife retention system, and a lot of things that you want to check out on that package. Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, man. It was great.
Fascinating conversation. Like I said, we could be here all day. Thank you so much again, folks, for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and we will catch you all next time.